I don't know about you, but when I first started my studies in urban planning and so forth, there was a piece of classic writing that we all read, and that was called Urbanism as a Way of Life. This was written in 1938. Louis Wirth was a German immigrant to Chicago. He was a sociologist. He was at the University of Chicago, and he began his career there at a time when rapid urbanization had occurred in Chicago itself. And so that became the subject of his study. In fact, they associated with a number of prominent people, Robert Parks, Richard Redfield, and so forth, who were very interested in creating some sort of theory about what was different about living in cities than in living in other places. And so he came up ultimately with this classic essay called Urbanism as a Way of Life, and they created something called the Ecological School of Sociology, always associated with Chicago, so frequently people call it the Chicago School. And this informed people's thinking for many, many decades in terms of what kinds of public policies should be developed around the ideas about how living in a city would affect people's social behavior, their organizations, and so forth. And so what they did first of all was say, well, how do you define a city? You know, what is a city? This seems pretty basic, right? When you think of a city today, what do you think of? Of a lot of people, right? Clustered in a large area, but dense. So heterogeneity, right? A lot of heterogeneous individuals are clustered together. That's basically the thoughts that Wirth had as he observed what was different. In his case, he was looking at rural areas versus urban areas when he studied these places. And he said, okay, what kind of theory could we develop around the fact that you have people living in this arrangement where you have three basic characteristics? The places are large, the population is dense, and the population is heterogeneous. What kind of theory can we develop around this in terms of how people behave? How do you think people behave when they're placed in large, dense places? They trade more. Yes, because they have, if they're heterogeneous, he's talking about not only demographically heterogeneous, but economically heterogeneous. Built into that is the idea then that people would be able to exchange goods and services because of their skills. They may be more stressed out, they may be more creative, which may contribute then to the prosperity. The creativity and the agglomeration, the proximity of people will create opportunities for economic growth. He didn't go that far, but that thought has come out of this idea that he's put forward. Well, maybe there's more survival of the fittest in this competition, so it might be more progressive to live in a city. In a city, he argued, first of all, people are not going to go down the street and say hello to everybody because it's impossible, right? Not only is it impossible because of the density, but you don't know who these people are you're saying hello to, right? So you're a little more suspicious about that. You're more guarded. You're more careful about what you do in those circumstances. So that's how you behave. In other words, you're a little more anonymous in the city, he's arguing, that because of this heterogeneity and the density and so forth. And you know segments of people's lives. You know people that you have interchanges with. If you go to a bakery, you know the baker. If you go to the dry cleaner, you know the dry cleaner. If you go to school, you know your teacher, but your teacher doesn't know all about you. In other words, your lives are very segmented, and so not all of you is known. All right, so later on, other people did studies and disproved some of these ideas. In particular, they looked at neighborhoods and said that neighborhoods were more like the small town areas, and not all of these characteristics pervaded, but basically when you talk about the city as a whole, these are the kinds of things that affected people's behaviors and the kinds of organizations that they joined. People would join organizations to promote their interests, to meet people, or these kinds of things would evolve in cities. And so as a result of this thinking, which goes way back 70, 80 years, we developed a number of policies as to how we should design and manage cities. So we began to think about laws to manage the environment. And from the point of view of planning, we thought about how to manage the land so that it would be safe and healthy and equitable and so forth. So we began to create a whole institutions that dealt with how you operated in the city. We talked about public goods, what was public and what was private, and we began to think about how that would be managed, though that, you have some of that in the rural areas, non-urban areas, but nonetheless there was more talk about that and how you separated public and private. Or you had to figure out management procedures rather than individualized procedures. You had to have management processes, public spaces, where they would be and how they'd be controlled and who could use them and having them even. Okay, how you'd move people, what kind of public housing units you'd have. Maybe you need to think about affordable housing policies, but basically when you're talking about trying to address issues that evolved in these cities where the person was anonymous, where you didn't have the kinds of safeties that you might have in a smaller city, you tried to design into that ways of creating the smaller town rural environment. And who was the big promoter of that? What about Jane Jacobs? Yeah, why was she writing this book, by the way, which was called The Death and Life of the American City, which she didn't care for Robert Moses, but more broadly, she didn't care for the kinds of thinking and designs that had been evolving in, well, from the time he was writing up through the post-war period of how one would design and manage and plan cities, right? And so she was really rebelling against a number of designs that had come forward to say we need to replicate other situations where we can counteract this business of places being large, dense, and full of heterogeneous people. And she went so far as to talk about how long the blocks should be, that they should be able to be walkable, they should be mixed use, there should be all these kinds of things, all meant to make the quality of life in cities better than what she was seeing in this post-war period. So we had this trajectory of thinking about theories of what kind of public policies should be developed in cities that are based on observations that people make at certain times that become theory that inform public policy. So what I'm wondering is if we couldn't think about informality as a way of life and what kind of definition we would give informality, what kind of theories we might have, and what are the characteristics that informality writ large brings to today's rapidly urbanizing places. 90% of the city is informal. The range of informality in the developing world goes from somewhere from 30 to 90%. What's our theory about how you deal with informality? Well, how do you define informality? What are the characteristics of informality? There's been a lot of writing about this, by the way. A lot of writing that's kind of been sectoral. I don't think there's been writing, and I may be wrong on this, so I would love to be corrected. I don't think there's been anything that's taken informality and turned it on its head and say, okay, informality is a way of life in these places. How do you define it? What are the characteristics and what do we do about it in terms of how we develop public policy, theory, and then programs to deal with informality. So I've just arrayed a number of people who talk about informality, but this is just skimming the top of the vast amount of literature there is around it. But I've highlighted two at the larger photos here to give you two extremes. So you have Margaret Chen on one side, who is associated with Harvard and has been very active in creating something called WeGo, which is an association of women informal workers and finding ways to protect and advance their cause. And I just took Norman, I don't know how to pronounce his name, you're from the World Bank, well, we'll just pronounce his name Loyaza, who a year or so ago gave a talk about informality from an economic point of view, from the World Bank's point of view, and represents that view. And then at the bottom, a number of sort of forefathers of this, or forebearers of this whole idea. Oscar Lewis, the anthropologist who did a lot of ethnographic work and interviewing of families to understand how they survived, what their lifestyles were, in a number of books, one called La Vida. Keith Hart, who worked in Ghana and discovered and named informality, and then of course Hernando de Soto is known for what he thinks the power of informality should be. And there are just many, many, many other authors. But I don't think anyone's brought it all together with this idea of a theory for this. I misspoke when I said he didn't discover it, he labeled it and created this idea of a duality between the formal and the informality, and then he gives all the characteristics of why he thinks this informal kinds of activities occur, which there are lots of definitions of it. Basically, the simplest one is that these are people and activities that are working outside of a regulatory environment. That informality has many institutional forms. It's the unleashed power of informality, right? It's not recorded, it's unleashed. All we have to do is a few things, and we can unleash it, and it can then contribute, in the case of what we're talking about, sustainable urbanization, or the three stools, the three legs of the stool, the economic prosperity, the dealing with equity, and dealing with economics. If you unleash it, then maybe then you'll be able to achieve some of these things in a little better form. It's just the thought here. So the kinds of words that come up when you review the literature in terms of this is the size of the informal economy, particularly in the developing countries, that it's huge, absolutely huge, but nobody knows exactly how huge because they don't know how to count it. Many say it might be quite segmented, but they're segmented in different kinds of types of work. The types of work, the kinds of work, whether it's non-agricultural or it's some form of agricultural work that carries through right to the distribution of agricultural products, whether it's services, the dentist in the public square who's taking care of the teeth of people coming through there, those kinds of things. So it's segmented into different types of sub-activities, and you could apply that all the way across the sectors that we were talking about. We usually talk about an informal economy, informal transport, informal housing, informal land. I'm trying to think of other segments, other informal sectors. Can you think of any other sectors, at least that pertain to us in this discussion of cities? So those are the main ones that I can come up with. At any rate, it's unregulated, we said. It's usually small scale, few people, family-oriented oftentimes in terms of when they talk about the economics activities and also in some of these transport activities. There are those who think it's extremely flexible, which is an advantage, right? Because you can adjust quickly to changing conditions. But the workers in an informal arrangement, or the people who live in informal arrangements, are unprotected by any kinds of safety regulations or state-regulated kinds of activities that would make sure nothing happened to you or your house or your car that you're driving. And there's a question as to whether they're transient or permanent. Is informality a permanent thing? This duality is a false duality because there are some who say, let's just take economics. Some people work in the formal sector and some people work in the informal sector and they never touch each other. Well, not true. Not true at all in many places. Many places, the supply chain for the formal sector comes out of the informal sector. In the transport situation, the jitneys or the motorcycles or whatever are run by individuals, small things. They are moving people in the city, right? They're not regulated, they're not controlled. We don't know about safety issues, but they are moving people in the city. And so the question is, do we wipe them out because they're informal and illegal? Or do we think about how to get the benefits of what they might be bringing into, I hate to say into the formal system because that's not what we're talking about, into the city arrangements, we'll just put it in those terms. And there's a big economic question. The economists tend to say, oh, the more developed you are, the less informal activity there'll be. That's been the sort of theory of informality in the economic activities. And so my question is informality really transient? Does it really go away? Or does it take on different forms with growth of development? I think there's a lot of research to be done in this area to be thinking about this. Is it inefficient? Or is it an efficient solution to survival mechanisms in particular areas? These are just questions. Okay. So it's hard to know exactly who's, in terms of the economy, how many people are working in it or not working in this. These are just some figures that I've come from different sources that are trying to estimate what this is. Some argue that basically in this duality that we're talking about, the informal is larger than the formal in terms of numbers of workers. Some point out differences in terms of development and the kinds of informality that you have. And I wonder if this is a question of monitoring definition or whatever in terms of this, that little group of figures down there. OECD has done a number of studies on this, looking at that. And then other studies that try to assess regionally exactly the amount of informality in different places, showing you that according to their data and how they define what informality is, there's a good deal of range in these different regions. This was a segmented thing that comes from Martha Chen, who has done some very interesting work thinking about this, talking about the different types of, and she's particularly interested in women, so she's trying to segment it between men and women's occupations, and from the different kinds of occupations and the kinds of earnings that come from these different occupations. So in informal activities, you can certainly have employers who employ other people to work for them. Think of the trash pickers, for example. You think of the stratification that happens in waste picking organizations and so forth. So you go all the way down this group of activities and talk about earnings and so forth and who's doing what. So the question that rises from this is, do you need differentiated kinds of public policies that address whatever the issues might arise from the people who are working in these kinds of occupations, if you are going to be thinking about informality in this way. Housing. Informal housing, I know all around this table you're very well versed in what this is all about, but obviously unregulated. Obviously when you're talking about informal housing, and these are two images from a Brazilian favela to talk about the evolution of informal housing. The first one probably was taken, the black and white one was probably taken 1960, 1965, and the colored one is more contemporary. What do you see has happened here? The materials are different, right? The materials are very different. In the black and white picture, they're little shacks made of timber and tin and maybe one story. And then you look over here, and what do you have? You have brick, and yes, it's grown in terms of number, but it's also grown in terms of people putting different floors on it. I'm sure you've studied some of these patterns and this is what we talk about, what I'm thinking about basically. We need to talk about the holistic vision of informality. What happens when someone's working in the informal sector, has certain permanence of income, buys the 16 pieces of brick and cinder block to put on the house and slowly makes that house more permanent. So is this transient housing? Is it permanent housing? What does informality mean in terms of people's behavior when you're part of an informal economy and an informal settlement, and how do you behave in this? What kind of decisions do you make in terms of how and where you're going to live, how you're going to spend the resources that you have because you're in this particular position? What does informality mean in these circumstances? I have more questions than I have to tell you answers. These are actions that are happening in an informal way. They're not being responded to by the institutions that exist, is what you're arguing. If we change those institutions, maybe that would redefine how the informality that we're seeing here would occur. And so I guess my thought is that, yes, in an ideal world, that would be the case, but we also have this with us now, and we have to address it, right? We have to think about what this informality means. We have no idea, really, and this is the point of Bish-Daniel's article, chapter in this book, the last chapter here. We have very little idea about the decision points that the people living in these places make. I mean, how do they make their decisions? How do they decide whether to go here or there, or to buy the brick, or to participate in whatever they're participating in the informal economy? We have very little research that explains any of this because we haven't really addressed this idea of informality and the behaviors it's creating. That's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to make any big predictions here, but just trying to argue that we need to understand the dynamics of cities today, and basically, as we started out, the premise of this discussion was that informality has become a way of life, and we need to understand more about it. That's really what I'm arguing. And so in transportation, of course, informality has also, as we just heard earlier, become very, very important in terms of a mode of moving through the city and how important it is for people. There are, this example is a kind of an interesting example. Some university people decided they would study the Matutu system in Nairobi, and they'd make what looks like a modern subway map up here, which was basically, they went out with their cell phones, and they talked to people, and they created this map. And this is kind of an interesting idea about how one might address issues of informality just by instance of this case. In describing this case, when riders were shown this map, they had no idea, for example, the person who lived down here had no idea he could get up there because he didn't know what the system was. And so here you have this informal system that is delivering a service, but it's incomplete service because there's not been any sort of way of systematizing the information for the people who might use it. So understanding, and this goes back to your question, Annie, what do you do when you've got, what was the 60% of Mexico City is working with informal transportation? Probably, I don't know that there's a map of the Mexico City informal transportation. You have informal systems, you have formal institutions that come in and show what these informal systems are. Then what do you do with them? I mean, do you get them on the cell phones of everyone who exists? Do you show the school children what it is? How do you use this information if indeed you're going to accept that this informal solution is not transient, it's going to be around for a while, and maybe you ought to make it work better for the users. And that's just, I'm proposing that. I'm not suggesting it. I'm just saying these are the kinds of things I think we need to be thinking about in terms of how we think about how you obviously define it, but how you use information about informality to support the ideals that we all have to make cities' quality of life better and more inclusive. Because if this is used properly, then the poor person who lived down there in South and needed to go north would know how to do it, which he didn't, or she didn't know how to do before. So that's the only point I'm trying to make about this. And then land use, of course. You've all seen Sally Angel's work and the work of understanding urban expansion, how it's happened over time, and getting inside of that, trying to figure out how and why it's happening, and what are the drivers of that, and what, how much is informal, how much is formal, and so forth. I was working on a project, I just showing this because, as you all know, the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to measure certain things, and one of them is Goal 11, one of which is trying to measure the planning effectiveness, and the indicator that was chosen for this was something called a land efficiency indicator, which would look at the rate of population growth over the rate of land consumption and record that figure for the use of local decision makers. They wouldn't tell them whether it was bad or good, they would record it and show whether the population was growing faster or slower than the land consumption, with the idea of their thinking about whether this was a good idea from the point of view of moving people out of dense places. They might be too dense, and maybe it is a good idea that the land is being used up faster than the population growth, or whether it's a bad idea, I'm giving you extremes, because it represents sprawl. But the point is, when you've got a global agreement where you're saying you want to promote certain things and you want to measure certain things, again, it's definitional, and you have to leave it to the local people decide how they're going to implement these ideas and what the indicators are going to show them. And again, in the land issue, in terms of informality, is it efficient or inefficient in terms of how places are growing? And I know you're working on this here with what you're doing. So all of this is background to talk about how we got to doing this little book. And Susan Wachter, who co-directs the Penn Institute for Urban Research, and I worked with recent doctoral graduate Sirhana Chatterjee to set up a small conference to talk about, with regard to real estate markets, how, and this is just a small segment of this larger question of informality, how real estate markets have adapted to informality, basically. And so this is just an outline of the things that we dealt with, and it ends up with, the book ends up with a set of questions that we really need to be working on. But basically, we have a piece comparing the different governance and approaches of China and India in terms of real estate markets. Then another person did an essay about what you could learn from the World Bank databases and whether they gave legitimacy to certain theories about real estate markets and land use. And then there was a whole 4 or 5 articles talking about whether giving title to informal settlements has good effects or bad effects. And there's a lot of discussion around that if you do provide title, then people have access to credit, they feel secure, they'll make investments in their property, but there are also some bad things that might occur as well, so there's a discussion around that. There's a piece that, as I was mentioning earlier, that Janice Perlman did with great detail, talking about how in the Brazilian favela, in a particular Brazilian favela, they've created a shadow certification registration system that seems to smooth or grease the wheels in terms of transactions, but it has no legal basis. But it's a practical solution to how one has transactions there. When you regularize public land, who benefits? And that particular study showed that usually people who've been there a long time benefit, but if you're a renter, you don't. Dealing with ambiguity is basically dealing with some of these topics. And the last issue was looking at the differences in peri-urban land markets, those outside of the ring. I think you're dealing with that in the work that you're doing. And then we had a survey on Mumbai looking at the different kinds of policies that had been practiced in Mumbai itself in an attempt to deal with housing, with none of them really being successful. But an assessment of how and why they worked and why they weren't successful. We talked about, there's another essay that talks about land use regulations and whether they're beneficial or not, and whether they help with the integration of informal settlements into cities themselves, because that's really a very important topic as to whether these informal settlements become part of the city or not, which is certainly an objective. Then we have a piece by a colleague of mine who's a landscape architect who's going back, and I think you looked at sites and services here in a talk here. He's looking at how you can implement sites and services programs from the point of view of what kind of actions one must take to occupy land that will become public land, and you want to preserve it for public good, and you have a sites and services type approach which allows for people to take, invade the land and use the land, or you set out the armatures for it. How do you protect those pieces that in the future you're going to need for the school or the health center or whatever, what kind of things you can do, and he talks about that. And then lastly, I think the most provocative piece of it all is this Bish-Sanyel article where he's talking about what we really don't know. Basically, as I mentioned before, what are the preferences of people who are living in informal areas and using informal services? There's a big discussion among the urban economists. Do people choose to work in the informal economy because it's freer and there's more flexibility and so on and so forth? What kind of choices are people making in their housing? What kind of choices are they making in their transportation? Are they forced to, or are they making these choices because they're better for them? There's not a whole lot of work that really talks about the effects of and evaluates formalization in terms of land and real estate markets, so there's a questions about that. And then the last area that he's pointing out for research is the agency. Who's doing what, where, and when? And so there's a whole frontier out there for us to work on in terms of thinking about that. So it was a fun book to put together, and these are people are continuing to think about those things. So just some thoughts about your report. I love how you're doing it, basically. I think it's just great. You know, equity is your entry. I think that's, you know, no one can question that. I think the way you have framed cities in terms of range from struggling to thriving is a new way of thinking about it. And certainly when you look at the map, you can see exactly where the actions have to be. Your challenges, your priority areas for action, look, you know, really important. And your three underlying themes, the governance, finance, and planning. Who's going to argue with that? But the real question is, how do you actually get these things done? And I think that's where we need really tangible, on-the-ground research that talks about the critical success factors and what needs to be done to get the kind of governance we need, and the financing and the planning. So that's, just want to praise you for the really good work you're doing here, and I think it's going to make a difference in how people think about things. But I would urge you to think about informality holistically. So.